Welcome aboard the Athletics Can't Wait Jets podcast, your nonstop shop for all things Jets with Tim McMaster, Zack Rosenblatt, and Marissa Dunn.
Can't wait.
Happy draft night, everybody. The pick is in for the New York Jets. They select Olu Fashanu. I got it right, guys. I got it right. It's easy. It's easy from here. We'll get it down pat, but not when they expected to make their first pick or when we expected them to, as the Jets do trade back one spot and pick up a couple day 3 picks along the way for that. We're going to break down the trade. We will break down Olu, of course, and get into all of that. Happy to have you here if you're watching the stream of the Can't Wait podcast, or if you're catching us early on Friday. We will wrap up day 1 of the NFL draft. I'm Tim McMaster, along with Zack Rosenblatt, our Jets reporter at The Athletic, and Marissa Dunn, who is, as we know, super producer, but taking it to another level tonight. Not only is she producing this live stream, but she's running the ticker for the Athletic Football Show live stream at the exact same time. She's literally doing 2 live streams at the same time. So if she doesn't speak much tonight, you'll know why. But Marissa, excellent job as always.
This is always a fun night. I'm happy to be part of it. And if you're watching this one, head over to the Athletic Football Show feed after this.
But not till you're done.
Yeah, not till we're done, of course.
Zack, your favorite night of the year?
I do enjoy it. It is stressful. You know, you were joking with me because you try to get a pretty good idea of who a pick might be. And then things happen ahead of you. So I did some pre-writes and stuff. And
how'd that work out?
Those go out the window. You should book with all my pre-writes that didn't come to pass. Like I said, I had one of last year ready in case they didn't get Aaron Rodgers kind of thing. Like you have a lot of those over the years. I remember when I covered the Giants, I had a Dave Gettleman was fired pre-write for like 2 seasons because I thought he was going to get fired much sooner. So I just kept updating it over time. But anyway, it's fun. It's exciting. It's thrilling in the moment, other than when Connor spoils all the picks.
Hopefully everybody muted Connor tonight. Yes.
Yeah, in general, mute him. Like, it's not the worst idea.
Now, that's funny what you say, though, about those the stories that never get told or never get seen by people, because I had this conversation with Jason Stark, who's obviously been writing a lot longer than you have and has frankly covered a lot bigger things in the sports world, right? And he literally has stories that he has kept over all these years of like the wrong team winning the World Series, right? Like he has the Texas Rangers winning the World Series story from back in, 2011, when they lost to the St. Louis Cardinals in that wild World Series. He has like the Rangers won the World Series on his computer still.
I have one. I had a funny one when I covered the Eagles. Bo Wolf he still refers to it kind of to this day. I during training camp, I had like a feature writer to go about Clayton Thorson, a guy they drafted at quarterback. He was like awful, but good kid. And I would like talk to like people from college and high school, and then they cut him after training camp. And so that never saw the light of day. So Bo Wolf kept joking repeatedly, like, I'm still waiting for your Clayton. Well, he used to call him a bunch of different names, but I'm still waiting for your Clayton Thorson feature. That was like a recurring bit with him. So
it's coming. It's coming.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into the draft. Let's go through how we got to the Jets pick at number 11. It was chalk at the top, man. I mean, this thing was boring as can be. If you're for
the first 6, yeah.
Yeah. Caleb Williams, no shock, goes to the Bears at 1. Washington stays at 2 and takes Jaden Daniels. Patriots stay at 3 and take Drake May. So 3 quarterbacks. Then 4, it's Marvin Harrison Jr. to Arizona. The Chargers take the first lineman off the board, Joe Alt out of Notre Dame. The Giants get Malik Neighbors, a big weapon for them out of LSU. There was talk that he would go ahead of Harrison Jr., like late in the build up to the draft, but he goes 6 to the Giants. Tennessee takes Jason Latham out of Alabama. Then the surprise. Number 8, Atlanta, who signed Cousins already this offseason.
To a 4-year deal.
Yeah, to a 4-year deal. They signed Michael Penix Jr., who will be wrapping up his rookie contract when that deal ends for Kirk Cousins. So that was the surprise. And that set up the Jets, it felt like at that point, because we kind of talked about Odunze or Bowers. And at that point, one of those guys was going to be available. But Odunze, who I think the Jets probably really wanted, we can talk a little bit about that, goes to the Bears. So the Bears get their quarterback in Caleb Williams and maybe a number 1 receiver in Rome Odunze at 1 and 9. Then the Jets make the move. They move back 1 spot so the Vikings can move up to number 10. They take J.J. McCarthy. The Jets get 11, a 4th-round pick, number 129, 5th-round pick, number 157, and they also send number 203 in the 6th round over to Minnesota. And then we get to the Jets, who take Olu Fashanu, number 11. Let's start here, Zach. This was the smart pick.
Yeah, just to circle back to like how it played out in front of them. I'll start here. I think Rome Odunze was going to be the pick if he was there. I don't get the sense that they were looking to trade up. I'd heard today that there were teams, one specifically that was much later in the order, so it was a little harder to move up. That there was teams that wanted to move up to go and get him, but the Jets were planning on staying pat or moving back. I think that was it turns out that was always the plan. I think they were open to moving up, but I don't think they really wanted to give up assets as much as they wanted to get assets. So once Rome went off the board, I thought there was a chance he might make it to 10. It seemed like maybe there was a chance as it got closer and closer, especially with the Penix pick, which came out of left field. Obviously, you think, okay, maybe somebody will jump ahead to get JJ McCarthy, but that wound up happening at 10. So I do think it was a Dunze or an offensive lineman, I think, was ultimately what they settled on. Neighbors was another one. I'd say Neighbors and Dunze were like the two guys they had in terms, if they were going to get a skill position guy, it was going to be one of those two. And if those guys were gone, Joe is pretty dead set on picking an offensive lineman, is my understanding. So he picked the top one that they had on their board. I think they had Fashanu higher than JC Latham even. Not sure about Joe Alt. I think Joe Alt was the number one for most evaluators. But ultimately, Fashanu, I guess before I get fully into Fashanu, I should say Brock Bowers obviously was the one that everybody was projecting to the Jets.
A lot of people didn't. I'm even seeing in the chat right now, there's like a sigh of relief that they didn't.
Yeah, well, it was
that Bowers isn't going to be a special.
The fan base was very split on Bowers. That's for sure. Like it was I think he's going to be a very good NFL player, but ultimately, what I wanted to say is I think Joe Douglas deserves a lot of credit because I think that pretty clearly was a smokescreen. I think he made sure to, even in his press conference, if you go back and watch, like we weren't even asking directly about Bowers until the end when he was asked directly about like a tight end, but he kept like referring to, Swiss Army knife. There's a Swiss Army knife tight end in this draft. Like I think they really wanted to float out there that they wanted him. There were rumors Diana Rossini reported it actually, that the Rams were trying to trade up to get Brock Bowers at one point in the top 10. He wound up going to the Raiders a few picks after the Jets pick. Ultimately, like I think it would have been defensible to pick Bowers because I think he's like a win now player. But clearly, Joe Douglas wasn't making this pick only for this year because you don't pick an offensive lineman that's not projected to start right away. And if all goes well, he won't start a game this season, and that you don't really love that for a first round pick usually. But so this was a pick for 2025 more than 2024, which is surprising all things considered. Joe Douglas clearly didn't feel the pressure to get somebody right away. Like Woody Johnson didn't pressure him into getting a tight end or trading or getting Brian Thomas, who's still on the board as of we're recording this. I mean, that's going to change by the end of this episode, or by the end of the night. But yeah, so he didn't feel the pressure to go and get a guy that was for sure going to play on day one. Instead, they went and got their best offensive lineman on the board. They got a left tackle. He only played left tackle in college. We'll get into some stuff he told us, including that he's practiced a little bit at right tackle, but he's a left tackle long-term. And so you have a long-term solution at a position where you have an older Tyron Smith on a 1-year deal. So look, I think it's very defensible. I think that you can definitely debate whether you should draft someone who's not going to play right away when you're picking that high, but ultimately they picked a really good player. I think Olu Fashanu. Sorry, I need to get that name right. Because I've went this whole time thinking it was said the other way, but
I had more practice. I've been like literally the last hour. I've just been walking around my apartment going Fashanu.
So. Yeah, so I think it's a good pick. I don't think it's a bad pick. Maybe it's not an amazing pick, all things considered, but you picked a really good player, a guy who could hypothetically be your left tackle long term. You picked a guy that they drafted Mekhi Becton. He had all the tools, but he had to play right away. It's kind of like the Zach Wilson thing. He had to play right away. Instead, he's going to get to sit back and learn from his hero, which he told us about, which we'll get into. He's going to learn from Tyron Smith, ideally for the entire year, and then you play him next year, and then you have a left tackle long term, whether that's for this staff or whatever. But he's a guy that, long term, he could wind up being the best offensive lineman in this class. And I think the fact that you don't have to play him right away, it's appealing in terms of his development for sure.
I know you keep saying like he may not play this year. He may not play this year.
But it's the Jets.
I mean, we know better. Like,
yeah, he will.
The question is, when will he play, and maybe what position though? Like, when they signed Tyron Smith, we pointed out the fact that not only is he older, but he's not played a complete season in a few years. But you mentioned that he has worked out on the right side as well. So you look at this offensive line as constructed through the moves they've made. Tyron Smith at left, John Simpson left guard, Tippmann at center, Elijah Vera Tucker right guard, and then Morgan Moses right tackle, another older tackle. If Moses goes down, is the move to Olu in your mind at this point? Obviously, he has to get on the field, he has to work out. There's a ton of things. But do you think, like, in the Jets' mindset, are they considering with this pick, okay, here's protection for both tackles?
I go back and forth. I think the way Joe Douglas was talking about him, he kept emphasizing he's a left tackle. I think it's very encouraging that Olu can play, or at least he says he can play both sides. He worked out with Duke Manyweather, who's a great offensive line guru.
For a friend of the program, by the way, Duke.
Oh, he's been on. Yeah. Oh, nice. I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
Back in the Connor
he's talked really nice things about Mekhi Becton, but
yeah,
that's
he talks about his guys highly.
Yeah.
But he worked out for Duke, and Duke's a very good trainer. And anyway, he was working out at right tackle, is what he said, and then he practiced a lot at right tackle at Penn State. I think he's a high character kid too. I think he brings a little more maturity than the Mekhi did, frankly. Like, if we're just being honest, I think he's a really mature kid. He's athletic. I think he maybe has small hands, or he has small hands, so that's something to keep an eye on. But
he's ambidextrous, so that might make up for it.
But he's a big kid. He's athletic. He's really good as a pass blocker. He didn't give up a sack his last 2 years. He gave up one quarterback hit, according to PFF. He ranked as one of the best pass blockers in the country. I think run blocking, he's still developing, but you like him there. But anyway, to answer your question, like, remember, they do love Carter Warren. I think that is legit. And so, maybe this allows them to keep guys on one side. If they really do believe in Carter Warren, then you can have Carter Warren be Morgan Moses' backup. You can have Olu Fashanu be Tyron Smith's backup. You have Wes Schweitzer in the interior as your top backup. And I think you feel way better about that group, and maybe still add another interior lineman on day 2 or day 3 or something. But I think you feel pretty good about the fact that you have a starting caliber tackle ready to go. I mean, you saw, especially at tackle the last 2 years, like, they've gone through all of the guys that they invested in. They brought in guys off the street that started out of nowhere, and they just shuffled. I think there was something like 6 or 7 offensive tackles that played last year alone. So it's, they still have Max Mitchell too, who I think as a 4th tackle you feel better about than maybe your 3rd or 2nd tackle. So they're just in a much better spot depth wise. They're more protected. They have a lot of it. It's an insurance policy.
Aaron Rodgers is more protected.
Tyra Taylor behind him is more protected. So the goal is to keep Aaron Rodgers upright. I think Aaron maybe would have not preferred, but I think he was excited about the prospect of getting a weapon in here. Understandably, he's never. I think Rich Cimini reported this. He's never had a tight end or receiver that was drafted in the 1st round before, which is pretty crazy in his career, because the Packers never did, and that was always the thing. So, and they picked the defensive end last year. So, but this serves to protect him in the event that Tyron Smith misses games, which you assume he will because he does every year. You hope Tyron Smith gets to the playoffs. That's all that matters. And if Olu Fashanu has to play a few games, I think you feel pretty good about it, especially if he doesn't have to play in week 1. So I think long term, this is going to be a great pick, I think, for the Jets. And it kind of goes in, it's kind of a pick in the Will McDonald mold, frankly. Like, this is not necessarily a pick for this year. It's a pick for long term. And it's bold for Joe to do that. Like, I think it shows his belief that the team is going to be really good this year. And it also shows his belief that they needed a contingency plan if Morgan Moses or Tyron Smith can't go for whatever stretch of the season.
So the tail of the tape, you mentioned size, 6'6", 312, consensus All-American, almost entered the draft a year ago, but went back to Penn State. Big Ten O-lineman of the year this year. Finalist for the Campbell Trophy, which is kind of called the academic Heisman. So book smart as well. Team captain at Penn State. Checks all those kind of boxes that we know Joe Douglas likes, right? Like, seems like he's going to be a great locker room presence and all that stuff. And you got to talk to him, so we should get into that a little bit. What kind of stood out? Let's start with Tyron Smith. You said that's his guy.
Yeah, he literally said, well, first he said it feels like a fairy tale that he gets to play with him, because that was the first offensive lineman he ever watched. It was the guy he it was the model of what he thought a left tackle offensive lineman should be. He watched his film for years and years and years, and he's like his smile when he was just talking about the chance to play with Tyron Smith. It was really cool. So, a lot of times
that's what this stuff's all about.
Yeah,
like
totally.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. And and he gets to play with Aaron Rodgers, which he was really excited about too. But the offensive line, I mean, there's not many better. And I haven't interacted with Tyron Smith yet. I get the sense that he's he's a lead by example guy more than maybe like a rah leader type guy. But he's the best example of a left tackle maybe in the league over the last decade. So it's there couldn't be a better two. I mean, none of us thought they were going to get Tyron Smith in the first place, and now you both have him and you have his successor already in place, and so it's a really cool situation for Olu. Like I mentioned, he talked about how he thinks he has some flexibility. He talked about how he knows he needs to improve as a run blocker, but he just seems like he really has a really good head on his shoulders. I know our Penn State writer, Aubrey Snyder, sent me an article that she wrote about him. I haven't dug into it yet, but I know it goes in depth into his background, and it seems like he has a really fascinating background too. So I'm gonna dig into him and learn all about him in these next few days. But I think they got a winner in terms of locker room presence. They've done a really good job with that the last couple of years, dating back to the 2022 class, where every single one of them was both talented and a good dude. And I think he keeps that going, and I think he's going to fit in here really, really well. And if he can take Keith Carter's coaching, and which not everybody can, I think Makai was an example of someone who didn't, and some others in the past have obviously complained about Keith, but he has all the tools to be a really good offensive lineman in the NFL, and they have the ability to be patient with him.
Scott Docterman's doing the grades for the draft for The Athletic. He gave the Jets an A for this pick, and he's a Big Ten guy. He's an Iowa writer, so he's seen a little bit of Olu over the last couple of years at Iowa. Anything else stand out from the interview, or should we move on to some other things?
I should say I thought it was when Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh also talked to us, as we mentioned. I did find Joe was like he avoided answering the question when he was asked, would you have taken one of those receivers if they were there? Which it might as well be an answer because, they pretty obviously would have. Otherwise, it's a lot of the stuff that you expect. They're very excited to get this guy in the building and all that stuff, and they clearly had him rated as if not their top offensive lineman, maybe two. It's an offensive lineman that's not going to play is not the most exciting, sexy pick. It might not make the headlines in the New York Post tomorrow on the back page. I think that'll be Malik Neighbors probably, because that's the wide receiver is always going to be the sexy pick. And that's why I think Jets fans were excited at the idea of getting Rome. I predicted him both in my final mock draft and today before the draft, just because everything I've been hearing is that he was their top guy. And they didn't.
Can you imagine if the Giants had taken JJ McCarthy?
Oh man, yeah,
that would have made the back.
I think everybody thought that was going to happen, and once that didn't, it kind of opened up some craziness a little bit. So,
it did.
Yeah.
So they didn't take a receiver, but the thing is about this draft is that's the position, right? That everybody has talked about is that it's so deep. So if you look at it from that standpoint, there's plenty of guys available right now. But even if you look at the Jets staying at 72, like staying with that third round pick, there's going to be some talented receivers there's not going to be a number one option, maybe not a number two, but there's going to be receiver depth and guys that can play and fit into this offense probably this year available there if they want.
Yeah. I think that probably was part of the calculus. I imagine, they could have traded back further. Brian Thomas, again, is still on the board as of right now, and we're at pick 20, the Steelers pick. I don't know. I'm not looking at who's tipping picks right now, but Steelers are at 20. They need a receiver, so maybe Thomas goes now, but we'll know that in a minute. But anyway, they could have, in theory, traded back and gotten a receiver later, but, you factor in already, and I tweeted about this earlier. I laid out the three different scenarios. What I meant, I wrote down, the reasons why you draft an offensive lineman at 10, which we've discussed, the reasons why you draft a receiver at 10, and the reasons why you would draft Brock Bowers. But within the offensive line one, I think you're more likely to get a starting caliber receiver in the third round than you are to get a starting caliber offensive lineman. I'm not saying you can't get them, but I think the later you go in the draft, the more developmental an offensive lineman is, where I think you see star receivers going in every round these days. And this is a deep wide receiver class. I think they can get somebody really good in that third round. They have an extra fourth round pick to play with now if they want to move up. If Brian Thomas had
three fourth rounders now, right? 111.
Yeah, 3 fourth rounders, and they have a third.
You're going to be busy on Saturday, Zach.
unless Joe starts. I mean, I guess that still is busy, but anyway, so they have the opportunity to get a really good receiver if that's what they want to draft. And I still think they can get a starting caliber guy, a guy that doesn't. Again, if Mike Williams is healthy, then this is a guy that doesn't need to take on a huge role as a rookie. They believe in Xavier Gibson. They're paying all the money they're paying to Alan Lazard, so he's still going to be here. So yeah, I do wonder if that was part of the calculus. Okay, the top 3 receivers are off the board. We love these offensive linemen. If we could take an offensive lineman, we're still going to get a good receiver, we think, in a couple rounds. We have X amount of receivers rated as starting caliber receivers. And so I'm sure they feel really good. I know one guy that took a top 30 visit. I think they're intrigued by is Malachi Corley from Washington State. He's like a gadget type guy. I know Dane Brugler had them taking Malik Washington in the 4th round. He's another like gadget type guy from Virginia. There's some like speed guys that are intriguing. There's a 6'7" receiver from Florida State. I think his name's Johnny Wilson. Xavier Leggett's still on the board. Troy Franklin's a guy they hosted for a top 30 visit. I don't think he'd be there in the 3rd round if they move up. Roman Wilson from Michigan. He's a very athletic slot receiver. Jeff Ulbrich got a chance to coach him at the Senior Bowl, so they got a good look at him. So yeah, I think there's a lot of options here for them, and there will be. I think receivers are going to fly off the board in the 2nd round because I think there's a lot of good ones. But whether they trade up to the 2nd or they stay where they are in the 3rd, they're going to. I think if they pick a wide receiver, which it's nothing's guaranteed, they're going to pick the guy they think is the best player. But they're going to be able to get a good receiver still. So I think if they come out of the draft with Olu Fashanu and Malachi Corley, for example, I think you feel really good about that.
And they are in a good position to move up in the sense that with those 3 4th round picks, I mean, there's stuff to package to bump up to the 2nd round. Now, back to the trade a little bit, because obviously they move back 1 slot. So all they get out of that is like you give up a 6th with it and you get the 4th rounder and the 5th rounder. So it's not, I think ideally, right, if you're Joe Douglas, although I'm sure maybe they didn't want to draft back too much, but you would have loved if you're trading back to get a 2nd rounder out of that trade. How far do you think they would have had to fall back in order to get a 2nd rounder, as far as the math, the Jimmy Johnson stuff, all that stuff? Because it was probably part of the calculus, right? They may have had an offer that included a 2nd rounder and they would have had to fall back further, but maybe they were like, no, we want Olu, so we only want to go back a little bit.
Yeah. So, well, I think that's the issue. In order to get a 2nd round pick on the value chart, they'd have jumped back to the late teens, early 20s, probably.
You're not going to get
and
top line.
Joe Douglas, I think one of the interesting things he says was we feel like there were 9 non-quarterbacks that we would have felt really good about. So I feel like that's not a number that you jump back to 18 and still feel like you're going to get one of them necessarily.
Especially when the first 14 picks were offensive players.
Yeah, which is wild.
That's a record.
I mean, this is an offensive heavy draft, and I feel like these drafts are going to be pretty offense heavy going forward, frankly. So I think that was all part of the calculus. Once the Rams were trying to get in the top 10, I thought that was an intriguing spot if they wanted to get that 2nd round pick. But ultimately, I think they had a certain number of guys they were willing to take, and if and this is what happens as it gets to your pick, you add up. All right, so these are the amount of guys that we'd be happy with. So if we go back 3 picks, we can get one of them. So we feel good about going back 3 picks. They only needed to go back 1. I think there was some confusion about why the Vikings would have done that trade. What I would say to that, and by now it's been explained by people, but the Vikings were protecting against the possibility that another team was going to jump in front of them, like the Broncos who drafted Bo Nix. The Raiders,
which seems really likely, by the way.
Yeah.
Like I think the Jets at that point, once Adunze was off the board, they were going to trade that pick to someone. So
yeah. So I think Joe Douglas played it perfectly. Maybe he made them squirm. He made the Vikings think like we have an offer on the table. Like, what are you going to do about it? And he got an extra 4th round pick essentially out of it because they gave up the 6 they got in the Zach Wilson trade. And then they got back a 4th and a 5th. So it was really good move by Trader Joe. I don't think he's done making moves. Like I wrote in my story the other day, they're working on a trade that maybe doesn't necessarily involve rookies in this class. I would say that might be happening in the next few days, but so keep an eye on that, a little tease. But Yeah, so I think Joe is going to be working the phones possibly to move up still. I think that's definitely on the board, though I don't think they're dying to like give up assets right now. I think they'd rather receive assets, like I said. So I think that I don't know, it's something to keep an eye on. I mean, for tomorrow's going to be very interesting if we're just sitting around for the entire second round. It's more fun when you have a second round pick, especially the second round. There's so many. Second round's almost more fascinating to me than the first round, just because there's guys that were supposed to be first round picks that fell. There's some quarterback prospects that our team's going to reach to get them. Teams are trading up to get guys that dropped. Like, it always fascinates me the second round, because that's a lot of times where a lot of studs go to. So I'm fascinated to see if the Jets move up, because they have the pieces to do it.
Wait, are there any more quarterbacks left?
Well, okay, that's fair. That is fair. Yeah,
actually, it's funny. Spencer Rattler is actually like
He's
72.
the next one, yeah.
He's 72 on the Athletic draft rankings. So there you go.
Crazy.
And I like Michael Pratt quite a bit. I don't think he's a second round pick, maybe late third at earliest. But yeah, so that's a fair point. I
can't believe Bo Nix went 12, by the way. But
I mean, if you're desperate for a quarterback, and that always works out,
and they kind of
desperate and overdraft somebody. So.
I was watching ESPN, and apparently they had him. The Broncos kind of had him circled. That
By
was
the way,
I don't want to say that's their guy, because obviously if they're picking two, they're not going to take Bo Nix. But like they were apparently there were some Drew Brees comps that made sense.
The Broncos quarterback room has got to be one of the more uninspiring ones going into a season. I mean, it's Zach Wilson, it's Bo Nix. I guess we didn't talk about the Zach Wilson trade.
Oh, that's right. We didn't. And it's
that.
funny now. What a segue, Zach. What a segue. Because I think I sent you, when they made that trade, I think I texted you, because I was looking at, what's Zach up against? I just had to remind myself what he was up against in that quarterback room. And I was like, wow, he could start. But now, obviously, I think Bo Nix probably starts.
Yeah. I mean, you would think it'll probably be a competition, I imagine, but they have Jarrett Stidham there too.
A competition.
Yeah, I mean, Sean Payton, to his credit, I don't think is going to hand anything to anybody. But yeah, Bo Nix is already like 25 years old too, so there's that factor. But should we talk about Zach a little bit here?
Yeah. Then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. So what I'll say about that, I mean, it's kind of old news at this point, but the Broncos had been calling around about Zach all offseason, I think, since the beginning of free agency. I think they were waiting to see how the quarterback market would play out, if they were going to be able to get any of these guys, if they're going to be able to, I think they were open to the possibility that they could get a guy in the draft, but I think they wanted to protect themselves against it. And Zach Wilson was a guy Sean Payton had his eye on. I think he asked around about, his coachability, his willingness to learn, his skills, if he can improve in a new environment, all that stuff. I think they were doing a lot of research on him, which is why it didn't happen right away. I don't think there was much, if any, interest from anyone else around the league, which is also why the Broncos felt comfortable with taking their time. The fact that the Jets got anything for him wound up being, they wound up pretty much having to pay the Broncos to take him, which is not ideal for a guy he drafted second overall a few years ago. But as we all know, it was time to move on. Maybe he'll thrive in Denver. He's closer to his family in Utah. He's out of New York. I'm very curious to see the first time he talks what he's going to say. I do think by the end of his tenure, I think he matured quite a bit from the guy that showed up in New York. So, you do wish the best for him. I think his ceiling is probably a backup quarterback at this point, but Sean Payton's one of the best quarterback coaches the league has had in a long time. And Zach has to be willing to take hard coaching, because I think Sean Payton will coach his guys hard all the time. And if he can do that, then there's potential for him to become like an NFL quarterback for a long time. Maybe you're not a starter, but you can be in the league for a long time as a high-end backup. So, I'm very curious to see how his career plays out. I believe the Broncos are coming to New York this year, so it feels inevitable that he'll play and probably have the best game of his career. But yeah, so I mean, it's the end of a saga. I think everybody's already kind of moved on. It seems like Jets fans have kind of just moved on from him existing in general.
We can all look forward to the Zach Wilson, Sam Darnold Super Bowl in a couple of years. That just
true.
somehow happens. I was going to say, though, that Sean Payton, made it clear his lack of respect for the Jets coaching staff, at least on the offensive side of the ball last year. So it's interesting that then he gets this quarterback, and if he can kind of prove his point, if Zach goes out and looks great.
Yeah. And it is funny, this is the second trade they've done. Oh, they tried doing a trade with the Broncos early enough. So they tried trading for Jerry Jeudy. They were the only other team to present an offer, and I think they offered more draft compensation than the Browns wound up offering. It was a different kind of package, but it included more draft compensation. They went with the Browns deal. So this is the second time they've dealt with the Broncos, which it is just funny because Sean just like trashed the Jets, not just Hackett, but he made fun of them for being like the offseason champions or whatever. So, and he's a part of their offseason now. So it just, the NFL never ceases to amaze in terms of being weird.
The drama goes on. All right. I think that's going to do it. We've put a bow on this first round. If the Jets do something other than, if they take a receiver at 72, we'll probably wrap up the draft on Monday morning, I think. But stay tuned, because if Trader Joe does his thing and they move up and things get exciting tomorrow night, we'll come right back and do another stream tomorrow night. Marissa, how's the ticker?
Doing great. So if you're watching this live, head over to the Athletic Football Show feed, and they will also be having a live stream tomorrow night. So
and you can
some more draft coverage from Dane Brugler, Robert Mays, and Nate Tice. That is where you can find it.
2 reasons to go over there besides the great draft coverage, because it's second to none. But 2 other reasons. Robert Mays is a Bears fan,
and great mustache. Great mustache.
That was number 2. Number 1, they got Caleb Williams and Dunze. So he's like on cloud 9, like doing this stream. It'll probably carry him through the late part of the draft, the Bears have done. And his mustache has grown to legendary at this point.
Yeah, he may never get rid of it at this point. Like, you can't. It's a great night to be a Bears fan. So, I mean, you got to go check it out. So
it's true. Although he was really excited when they traded up to take Justin Fields 2 years ago too.
True.
So you never know.
Exactly.
All right. That's going to do it for us. Thank you for joining us late night here on a Thursday as the Jets take Olu Fashanu in the first round of the 2024 NFL draft. We'll be back with a full recap of the draft at the beginning of next week. Thanks to everybody for joining us. Bye-bye.